third session today, Chiara, Berra, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I will start in medias res for the sake of time. So please try to follow me. I put some quotes on the presentation, so it might be easier to follow. So this paper is called When a Joke is Not Funny, Irony or the Uncanny. The historically imposed characterization or definition of irony comes from Quintilian, who defines it as a figure of speech. And now let me turn the slide. As a figure of speech in which contrarium id quod intelligendum est, which means the trope in which something contrary to what has been said is to be understood. Similarly, Søren Kierkegaard writes at the end of the 19th century that in irony, the phenomenon is not the essence, but the opposite of the essence. In other words, irony is for Kierkegaard the apparent disparity or misunderstanding between language and as phenomenon on the one hand, and as meaning or essence on the other. Indeed, at the turn of the century, the concept of irony was a prerogative of literary critics and creative writers. Hence, even Kierkegaard wrote, quote, "There is much talk these days about irony and humor, especially by people who have never been able to practice them, but nevertheless, who know how to explain everything." Basically like me right now. Sigmund Freud gained some celebrity in Europe with the 1905 publications of The Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious, but the concept of irony received minimal attention in it. We would have expected an insightful perspective of the concept from an essay, Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious, that explored the psychogenic of the comic and the technique, the meaning, and the purpose of jokes. The fact is all the most surprising, because psychoanalysis, since its very beginning, has examined those instances, such as dreams, which mean something else, often the opposite of what they display. Nonetheless, throughout the book, irony appears only twice, without further clarification, clarifying the differences between the effect and the role of irony, and that of the normal jokes. In all of Freud's writing, the word irony or ironic only occurs a handful of occasions, and most of which are to be found in his private correspondence. This essay aims to articulate what I argue is the main reasons for Freud oversight at irony. At the dawn of psychoanalysis, Freud displayed in his work a rigorous, almost positivistic, albeit always fundamentally dualistic approach, which privileged a theory of psychic forces concerning the action of libido and pleasure principle. Only his later production do we find an opening for the conceptualization of a tendency, a negative force that opposes the pleasure principle. Therefore, I believe Freud could not give a satisfactory account of irony in his theory of humor and the comic developed in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious. Irony, as we will see, is indeed the experience that primarily deals with the negation rather than affirmation. However, after completing Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud writes a peculiar essay, borderline with the literary, describing the psychogenesis of the feeling of the uncanny. This analysis...
We still see goal.
Yes.
Freud.
I'm going to move on in the next slide. This is already the quote here. So this analysis reveals a connection to Kierkegaard's notion of irony, and hence it appears that there is in fact a place for irony in Freud's work, which is an existential opening to the unconscious, even more fundamental and original than that of dreams and jokes. Irony will be indeed not a species of subcomic, as he writes in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious, but the foundation of a possibility of the encounter with the unconscious disruptive drive. I believe it is relevant to give a clear account of how irony and the uncanny are superimposable concepts, because they could not possibly be exhaustively analyzed in the Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious prior to the theorization of the death drive. Okay, so let's continue with where we find it in Freud, which is only in a few cases. We find surprisingly infrequent the mention of irony, and I ran a content analysis on the standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud through the psychoanalytic electronic publishing browsing software, and the result shows that these terms appear only in 5 private letters, 4 times in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious, once in Note upon a Case of Obsessional Neurosis, once in Psychoanalytic Notes on an autobiographical account of a case of paranoia, and twice in Moses and Monotheism. In most of these occurrences, irony is used colloquially en passant to refer to a surprising situation, eventually resolved contrarily to expectation, under some pre-envisioned direction. But I will limit my exposition in this part only to one example to show Freud's evident familiarity with the ordinary and literary use of the concept of irony. And I chose this passage from a letter dated December 16, 1883, in which Freud recounts Marta, a biographical episode in which, while on the train, he was victim of an anti-Semite aggressive behavior because of his unwillingness to close the train's window. And the situation escalates to the point in which the conductor arrives. And Freud gives this last comment saying that the anti-Semite replies to him after the arrival of the conductor with ironic politeness and renewed his request again. And he replies saying, "No, I do nothing of the kind." So basically, this last instance of irony follows by the book, the mention that we did of quintillion figure of speech. That is like something that is contrary to what has been said is to be understood. Because the tone that the anti-Semite use as a strained context betrayed the real meaning of his words, producing the effect opposite of that of politeness. I believe we could all agree that this time in his narration, Freud describes nothing could be considered even remotely close to what we call humorous. Nevertheless, the term ironic applies. And this is going to be in contrast to what he says in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious. So, detouring in this text will provide some of the fundamental characteristics of the theory of humor, because I hope that considering this earlier point of view, we can untangle his understanding of jokes and humor before delving into irony specifically. So in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious, Freud investigates the technique, the motives, the purpose of jokes and their connection with the category of the comic and dreams. According to his analysis, jokes and dreams function and purpose are outstandingly similar. So in both seemingly insignificant instances of a man's life, something repressed that had to remain hidden in the unconscious comes to the surface in disguise. So indeed, we don't really make the joke, as we tend to say in ordinary speech, but the joke comes to us as an indefinable feeling of a sudden release of tension, a sort of absence. Jokes and dreams, as it seems, operate their concealing by means of the same technique of condensation, determination, and representation, but with some fundamental differences. First of all, and I shall come back to it later, where dreams are primarily imagery and fantastic visual representations, jokes are clothed in words. Secondly, a fundamental characteristic that Freud posits as the motive of the psychogenesis of jokes is its nature of being a social gesture, as he frequently states that, quote, no one can be content with having made a joke for himself alone, because a joke is only realizable in reception. So the joker usually does not laugh at her own jokes, but wishes for the audience to do so. So the pleasure then comes in this case in generating pleasure in other people. Lastly, and more crucially, quote, dreams serve predominantly for the avoidance of unpleasure and jokes for the attainment of pleasure. So indeed, according to the author, pleasure, being the force and purpose for jokes, comics, and humor, would rise from a short circuit in the economy of psychical expenditure, respectively upon criticism and inhibition, ideation, and feeling. Now, the primary example of achieving pleasure through jokes would be, first of all, the recognition as the rediscovery of what is familiar. Secondly, according to Freud, pleasure arises in the liberation of the nonsense, which comes from the authoritative prohibition of the last part of childhood of saying absurdities. Because jokes, he says, are essentially made by the opposition between thinking it senseless and recognizing it as sensible. To put it in another way, joking is fundamentally grounded in emotion and is a product of the, quote, compromise between the demands of reasonable criticism and the urge not to renounce the Asian pleasure in words and nonsense. Thus, once again, we are facing the opposition between ideality and actuality that we mentioned at the beginning, between reasonable criticism and nonsense that is in the examination of jokes. Freud understands the jokes as an impulse, we might say, to mask, for example, idiocy, or to liberate something in that it is doing for adults, quote, what play does for children. So it's our way to play, basically, with words. Similarly, in the introductory lecture of psychoanalysis, Freud writes about parapraxis, that is, for example, the slip of the tongue. And he describes them as a psychic phenomenon which can be explained by a convergence or a mutual inference between two different intended speeches. So the difference between these cases of sleep arise mainly from the fact that on some occasion, one intention takes the place of the other completely. So I say something and I mean something else, basically, but I don't realize it. A parapraxis is therefore an involuntary contradiction that intervenes in the speech between two opposing sentiments. Moreover, it happens sometimes, Freud writes that these distortions are regarded as funny. And when we hear one, we must in fact first inquire from the speaker whether they uttered it intentionally as a joke. Therefore, we might restate once again that there is something residing in the unconscious that we ought to conceal and that we're not consciously aware of in jokes as well. A joke is an instance that carries out a secret that is secret to us and to the listener simultaneously. Therefore, in light of Freud's lengthy and insightful description of the coming at the jokes as the positive place of liberation through opposition of a recondite and yet familiar pleasure, Freud's reading of irony seems all the more superficial and surprising in this. Indeed, I will skip a very big question for the sake of quote for the sake of time, but I will quote it in a little bit passages, because he writes in the biggest comment on irony that irony is only a subspecies of the comic, which technically follows the quintillion rhetorical definition. And he writes that, quote, the representation by the opposite owes the favor it enjoys to the fact that it forms the core of another pleasurable way of expressing a thought, which can be understood without any need for bringing in the unconscious, end quote. So it seems that pleasure arises in irony from the economy of psychic expenditure as well, that derives from the quick mutual understanding of an unnecessary technical contradiction. So it only relates to the rhetorical problem. But it is problematic that to have this aspect participating in the idea of the comic, because in contrast, it would appear, even from its colloquial use and definition, to be something different, irony to be something different and perhaps more original than the joke. Therefore, after this technical description of irony, Freud explained how, even in dream work, the most direct access to the unconscious, representation by the opposite plays a far greater part even than in jokes. So dreams are more original than jokes. And in the interpretation of dreams and jokes and their relation to the unconscious, the duality operates on the level of the contradiction between conscious experience and unconscious desire. We would expect that the opposition and the dualism fundamental in Freud's psychoanalysis would also play a crucial role in language and verbal communication, that is the one of irony. If a joke is the positive affirmation of pleasure, irony should be something else, either an affirmation of something opposite to pleasure or a direct negation of pleasure. Indeed, irony is not quite comic nor humorous. It's not really a joke, but it participates in these ideas. So since the dawn of psychoanalysis, we have said that Freud posited a dualistic theory based on opposition. However, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud grappled with the enigma of repetitive and destructive behaviors that seem to be going to go beyond the pursuit of pleasure and appeared to contradict the life-preserving instinct. He eventually admitted that it was incorrect to postulate the absolute dominance of the pleasure principle over mental processes, the one that we've seen in jokes, because there is indeed another opposite force in our mental apparatus. So Freud's view has always been from the very beginning dualistic, as we said, but introduces a new couple of contrasts, which is the one between the life instincts and death instincts. In fact, he will conclude that the pleasure principle actually seems to serve the death instincts. Eros, therefore, which is the life instinct, is associated with the drive for life, pleasure, and the preservation of the self and species, and, quote, seeks to avoid the unpleasure, which would be produced by the liberation of the repressed, end quote. Thanatos, conversely, represents a contrary force, the self-subsidizing intellectual disposition in men pushing towards aggression, destruction, and a return to an inorganic state. So the compulsion to repeat and the need for punishment, which is connected with it, includes including them the self-punishment that culminates in conscience. So Eros strives for novelty because only in what is new, according to Freud, we can experience a type of pleasure. And Freud, for instance, about this says that if a joke is heard for a second time, it produces almost no effect. And just like a theatrical production never creates so great an impression the second time as the first. Indeed, it is hardly possible to persuade an adult who has very much enjoyed reading a book to reread it immediately. Novelty is always the condition of the enjoyment, end quote. So Thanatos is the contrary force. The compulsion to repeat and the need for punishment, which is connected with it, and included the self-punishment that culminates in conscience. Freud's concept of death, however, I think is interconnected with his exploration of the uncanny, or das Unheimliche in German. And when Freud in 1919 begins writing the essay of the uncanny, he actually had already written, but not yet published, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So he was aware of the force of the compulsion to repeat. He theorized it already. And this sentiment, this death drive, actually is what generates the sentiment of uncanny. It's interesting also Shelley's definition on the Unheimliche that sheds light on the meaning of this particular state, because he describes it as a, quote, the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light, end quote. So we experience a sense of uncanniness when something once familiar comes from an infantile source, comes back to us as familiar. So we are already accustomed to psychoanalysis with the idea of the return of the repressed material from the unconscious. But in this instance, going beyond the pleasure principle, we can understand the feeling as slightly sinister, as it recovers from the unconscious unsettling material like an old fear, contributing to the estrangement with the self. Even the double, Freud's right, which is at the beginning is considered as insurance against the destruction of the ego, so an energetic denial of the power of death, reverse its aspect once the stage of primary narcissism is surmounted. And, quote, from having been an assurance of immortality, it becomes the uncanny harbinger of death, end quote. Indeed, the uncanny paradoxically arises in the instances of the memory of the overcame primary narcissism, and becomes a thing of terror, just as after the collapse of the religions, the gods turned into demons. So the destructive impulse, my bad, sorry, I received a call in the wrong moment. The destructive impulse and the fear of annihilation or the unknown are central themed in the death drive and the uncanny. And the uncanny often involves a confrontation with the unfamiliar or a sense of impending threat, echoing the destructive aspect of the death drive.
3 minutes.
Yes, I'm just about the conclusion. So as stated in the introduction, I am to highlight the similarities between this concept of irony and the uncanny. And to begin with, when Freud approaches the topic of the uncanny, admits to exploring a theme that is primarily literary and aesthetic, and yet fundamentally neglected the realm of the move to the next slide. Neglected realm of specialists in literature and aesthetic. So Freud admits that, quote, literature is a much more fertile province than the uncanny in real life. This suggestion seems to imply a somewhat rhetorical technical use of language to evoke the uncanny, which we have seen in the first section as fundamental aspect of jokes and the comic. So to describe the uncanny, Freud begins by illustrating the etymology of the terms in its declensions in other different languages, soon to conclude that the dictionaries will not tell us anything new other than restating the ambiguous nature of this feeling. Hence, irony and the uncanny, due to their fundamentally narrative and highly contextual nature, are described by an open and vague definition, which simultaneously encompasses their positive and negative meaning. This essential ambiguity that characterizes both states is a source of their unsettling and caustic nature. Indeed, they can create a sense of discomfort or unease by challenging clear-cut distinctions between what is known and what is unknown. So indeed, we often see happening generally in literature that ironically elicit various emotional responses, including amusement, surprise, or even discomfort. And similarly, the uncanny has a psychological effect by triggering a mix of fascination and unease as the ordinary turns into something strange and disturbing. Indeed, as shown in the first section, irony can be a humorous joke made through a wordplay or a cunning attack directed to someone. I believe that this is a fundamental reason for why Freud writes in Jokes and the Relation to the Unconscious that irony is exposed particularly easily on the danger of being misunderstood. In other words, irony wants to be understood and misunderstood. An ironic joke only allows for a smile, but not a liberatory laugh, as a joke would. Moreover, irony and the uncanny share the characteristic of creating a crack in the perception between the reality and ideality that we posed at the beginning, and a turn that deviates from the expected or the conventional. In irony language, being language ideality, does not translate anymore into the reality of its meaning, while, quote, an uncanny effect is often and easily produced when the distinction between imagination and reality is affected, as when something that we have hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality, or when a symbol takes over the full functions of the thing that it symbolizes, end quote. I will conclude here by saying that the irony, like the uncanny, pertains to the psychical activity closely related to the negative destructive force of the death drive, and the purpose of irony is not to achieve pleasure in the mode of jokes through the economy of psychical expenditure and the liberation of nonsense. And even if it's impossible, even if it is possibly true that the material and content of an ironic comment covers are not as much as in jokes coming from a deeper, unfathomable repression consciousness, irony presents itself as the pure naked mechanism of Thanatos. Indeed, the meaning of an ironic statement does not rely primarily on the social as it is for jokes. It is mainly a private and first personal experience, the verbal expression of the compulsion for disruption. So whether I use irony in a tendentious way, and like the NTC might in the example, or in a case of self-irony, there is a tentative, a tentative of profound annihilation. So this violent negating force does not only invest the object of the ironic comment, but even the exact meaning of the language. Thus, if we are to approach irony from a purely linguistic perspective, the mechanism of affirmation through the negation of the very same idea clashes against the primary purpose of language and communication. Irony that drive aims from every perspective as the complete demolition of the bridges that connect reality and virtuality to create doubt and misunderstanding. Hence, irony cannot be accounted as a subspecies of the comic or a technical rhetorical figure of speech. Irony, as we have seen in this essay, by virtue of its paradoxical nature, as being the state in between the private and the social, the true and the deceiving, the linguistic and the performative, the humorous and the aggressive, is in fact the unstable condition of indefiniteness which underlines every psychical mechanism. And here I conclude.
You concluded.
I concluded.
Wonderful. In the case of Freud, we're often at the mercy of an unreliable translator. As you know, it starts from the term Witz, which is fundamentally ambiguous in German. So I'm wondering what Strachey did with German ironie, which I think in German carries much more of the sense of irony of fate, which the English also has, the fire station that catches fire, rather than the humor, the verbal humor related term. So can we be sure about Freud's ironie?
That's a good question. I do not know honestly what to reply to this, as in like of course we cannot be sure as we rely on translations every time. But I think that there was like a necessity for him to avoid talking about this term precisely because he didn't know where to put it. And like my point here is that whenever Freud wanted to talk about something, he talked about it and wrote extensively about it. And so to me, the uncanny was exactly like his way for talking about irony because of something that was talked too much about, only in literary ways, and he wanted to retake basically and reconquer the word that was basically only a rhetorical figure. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not that good with German, and I unfortunately read it only in Italian and in English. So I don't know if I can answer completely your question about the.
You threw the unheimliche at us, so I thought I'd throw it back.
They pronounce it right. Thanks.
I'm not sure it's a question, but maybe there is a question in what I'm about to say. So, Chiara, you're a philosopher, right? Okay, so I don't expect you to have read the linguistic literature on irony. But one of the findings that is pretty much uncontested because everybody agrees is that the definition of irony as saying the opposite of what you mean is just not tenable. and that the only definition that can carry through is that irony is saying something different than what you say literally, and literally is in quotation marks. So what does that do? I guess there's the question. What does that do to your discussion?
Well, I think it actually is aligned to what I was trying to say. As in, well, first of all, what for psychoanalysis, the main question is, do we ever mean what we say literally? Or do we always say something that is different from what we mean? Do we even know what we mean? So I think that is exactly the point. It's like irony is even more fundamental than anything else because it's the exact mechanism that we have inside of our minds, basically, when we construct an answer, when we say something. Maybe even me replying to this question, like I'm not exactly sure of what I'm saying, but there is always this contrast going on. Whereas like, and this contrast can be seen not only as, okay, I have something in the back of my mind and is repressed and then it's coming out, because that would not be a negation. It would not be something different. It's already like something that is part of, I think, like my thinking or something that I've lived, an experience that I've done. Whereas in this case, it's more like a tentative for, I don't know, what we call it, like self-sabotage, I guess, something like this, but just goes against what I'm trying to say, or in the tentative of discovering myself or my identity, there is this force that says like, no, but you are something different, or like you might want to say something different. And I think this is the verbal expression of it, is irony. So in a sense, we can also say like language in general is ironic, like always ironic, because if I say glass,
but of course,
glass,
if you say that, then you eliminate the concept of irony. So if all language is ironical, then no language is ironical. Therefore, we've defined irony away. So that's not a very good move on a chess playing game, right? I mean, you got to be careful with these things.
Well, there can be some things that are more ironic than others, no? If they have a different effect.
Absolutely. Well, but then we're back to the definition. There's a literal meaning, which is, when you say I'd like a cup of coffee in a bar, they give you a cup of coffee and you say, great, this is what I wanted. So it's literally, you're using it for a specific purpose. You achieve the purpose. Your request is being confirmed, that you pay, their request is being confirmed, the transaction went through, and it's literal. Okay. And then you have things where you don't quite mean what you're saying, right?
Yeah, but then we come back to like Wittgenstein problem of or like how we do intend language in the first place, as in like, is it a performative use or there are like some things that just don't mean anything. For instance, if I say hello, there cannot be like a true or false hello. Hello is just hello. But the point is,
have you ever seen Seinfeld?
Seinfeld?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, well, you need to watch Seinfeld because they have a low Newman, which is the opposite of a greeting. So I'm sorry to
Well, you can
break
have
this
an
to
ironic
you.
hello.
You can have ironical greetings.
Of course, but that's on the performative side. The point that I want to make is on the psychological side, not necessarily what you achieve in the practical life. Because this is why I think there is a difference between like the jokes and irony in this sense, because the irony is only like within yourself in this sense, if you want to interpret it in the psychological sense. Then of course we can also talk about like, if we talk about negation in general, and go to Hegel and be like, everything is negation of everything and everything has its negation. It doesn't mean that negation doesn't exist at all.
On that note, we're getting in dangerous territory. I mean,
Oh,
no.
yeah. Every time
Yesterday,
Hegel is
somebody mentioned
mentioned.
Husserl. We were in dangerous territory there. Thanks again, Chiara. Wonderful.